Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. The title of my talk is The Impersonal Essay, and it is the first part of a longer essay on the history and the aesthetic function of the personal essay as a genre that will be appearing sometime next year in the Cambridge Companion to the Essay, edited by Evan Kindley and Cara Whitman. So the talk, as it is structured, begins with an epigraph. And that epigraph comes from Theodore Adorno's The Essay as Form, and here it is. The essay form, however, bears some responsibility for the fact that bad essays tell stories about people instead of elucidating the matter at hand. To speak of the personal essay is to speak of a genre that is difficult to define, but easy to denounce, in a loud, almost indignant clamor to the world at large. The offending element is rarely the essay as a form. It passes unscathed. But its apparent content, the personal, a permanent temptation for a form whose suspiciousness of false profundity does not protect it from turning into slick superficiality, writes Theodore Adorno in The Essay as Form. Consulting even the soberest of entries in the Oxford English Dictionary does nothing to shake the dismissal and suspicion the personal evokes. If anything, it only intensifies it. The personal, we are reminded, is what is individual and private. Its concerns are bodily, physical. It signals the presence, immediacy, and particularity of a singular entity, not an abstraction or an impersonal force, nothing we might associate with social or collective cognition. A list of antonyms to the personal essay might include the structural essay, the communal essay, the public essay, the political essay, the critical essay, or the impersonal essay. Or, as Adorno insinuates in the epigraph to this talk, the good essay, which prioritizes elucidating the matter at hand instead of telling stories about people as bad essays do. What makes essays that tell stories about individual people, their bodies, their personalities, and their private lives bad? For Adorno, as for Walter Benjamin, whom Adorno names as his favorite essayist, essays about people betray an irresponsibility to their true object, the private individual. The private individual is not a particular person with a particular story to tell, no matter how distinctive, original, or purely bizarre the elements of that story may be. The private individual is not a proper name, neither Virginia Woolf nor Elizabeth Hardwick, not Joan Didion, David Foster Wallace, John Jeremiah Sullivan, or whomever you consider to be your favorite personal essayist. It is not the essay's author or its narrator. Rather, it is the idea that animates all of these figures, the powerful and unobtrusive concept that gives the personal essay the appearance of ventriloquizing a singular and spontaneous subjectivity. The private individual is the ideological apparatus that puppets the genre's first-person mode of address, the I that posits itself as both the subject and the object of its own understanding and asks its readers to receive it as such. Now, most essayists and scholars who write about the personal essay agree that its I is, by both necessity and choice, an artful construction. Watch, they say, as it flickers in and out of focus as a simulacrum, a chameleon, a made-up self, a distorting representation of the individual from whose consciousness it originates and whose being it registers. And I should say that those descriptors all come from different people writing about the personal essay, ranging from Edward Hoagland to Karl Kraus to Philip Lopate. Yet, having marveled at the first person's aesthetic flexibility and freedom, few critics, if any, put this claim through its dialectical paces. What if individual subjectivity were as much a fiction, an illusion, as the I with which it so prettily speaks? What if stressing the artifice and ornament of the first person were a clever, if largely unconscious, strategy for masking the personal essay's problematic, the internal limitations on what its author can and cannot say? What if the conceptual limitation of the genre were its interpolation of both reader and writer into the ideological process of individualism, its glittering veneer of expressive freedom, its seductive promise of speaking and writing as a self-determining subject? What if no performance of stylish confession or sly concealment, no amount of fashionably anguished hand-wringing over the essay's complicity or her privilege could shake this ideology loose? What if it only intensified its enchantments? To answer these questions about the personal essay, its mode of address, and the private individual that enlivens both, requires a biography of sorts, though assuredly not a personal one. According to Walter Benjamin, the private individual was conceived sometime between 1830 and 1948, during the reign of Louis Philippe, the citizen king and first bourgeois monarch. Under his rule, the European ruling class and the middle class came together to realize their defining goal, the separation of the public from the private domain, where, as Marx observes, the bourgeoisie could retreat to rejoice in property, family, religion, and order, while nevertheless continuing to participate in the exploitative politics of the public realm. Once labor had been cordoned off from life, once the productive activity of work had been separated from the apparently unproductive experience of dwelling, the private individual was born. He was quite naturally blind, deaf, and dumb to his own history as a derivative creature, an artifact of political and economic processes that he possessed little incentive to interrogate. The domestic sphere was his incubator, his sanctuary from any commercial and social considerations. There he could retreat, wide-eyed and mewling, to probe what he earnestly believed to be his thoughts, lodged in his self, his mind, his body, his home. The private individual, who in the office needs to deal with reality, needs the domestic interior to sustain him in his illusions, Benjamin wrote in the Arcades Project, explaining how the material ownership of private property mirrored the illusory ownership of subjectivity. He continued, "From these derive the phantasmagorias of the interior, which for the private man represents the universe. In the interior, he brings together the far away and the long ago." For Benjamin, the best representative of the private individual was the collector, the true resident of the interior as an architectural space of living and an existential space of being. For us, it might be the personal essay collection, which, now that the apartments are smaller and decluttering is in, props up the same ideological fiction. The purpose of this talk, then, is to argue that the personal essay's historic and aesthetic function has been to persuade us not just that personhood is beautiful or good or unique, but that it is primordial, that individual subjectivity and its expression exist prior to the social formations that give rise to it. This is a lie, the lie that subtends bourgeois individualism and all its intrusions into language, art, and education, as Adorno explains in the essay as form. And this is Adorno. The lie extends from the elevation of historical concepts in historical languages, to primal words, to academic instruction in creative writing, and to primitiveness pursued as a handicraft, to recorders and finger painting, in which pedagogical necessity acts as though it were metaphysical virtue. The personal essay appears as the purest, most unflinching and degraded expression of this lie. Certainly more so than finger painting or playing the recorder, I think. This is for the simple reason that in order for an essay to qualify as personal in the first place, the primacy of the private individual must be presupposed, implicitly, but by the same token with all the more complicity, Adorno writes. And so he concludes, such essays confuse themselves with the same feuilleton with which the enemies of the essay form confuse it. By my account, then, the personal essay is a modern formation and a formation of modernity. It is a wholly different creature from the essay birthed by Montaigne in 1570 and nurtured through the 17th century by Sir Thomas Browne, Thomas Fuller, and Abraham Cowley. Each of these essayists is less willing than the next to disentangle the knowledge of the individual from the condition of man or nature, a commitment reflected by how their prose slides with wonderful abandon into and out of the various third-person singulars. And I spent an afternoon running all of Montaigne's essays through one of those websites that basically counts all of the words for you. And it very helpfully told me that he and one appear with greater frequency than I across all 10 volumes of the essays. The I with and of which the personal essay speaks proclaims its distinctiveness from the we's that crowd the 18th century periodical essays of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, as well as the they's that throng the 19th century metaphysical disquisitions of Leigh Hunt and William Hazlitt. It bears a distant family resemblance to Charles Lamb's Essays of Elia, the quintessence of the spirit of bourgeois intimacy according to Murillo Paz. Yet if Lamb begets the line in the mid-19th century, and that would make sense given the kind of historical framing that I've offered for the personal essay, then he nevertheless takes some care to thwart its autobiographical mode of referentiality. Writing under a pseudonym lets him throw a small but shattering wrench into the personal essay's production of individual personhood, its demand for a single subject whose identity is defined by the uncontestable readability of his proper name, as Paul Deman put it in a related discussion of autobiography. No one has approached the Essays of Elia, writes Virginia Woolf in The Decay of Essay Writing. Published nearly a quarter century before Benjamin's The Arcades Project and a half century before Adorno's The Essayist Form, Woolf's lament about the aesthetic decline of the personal essay grasped the problem of telling stories about people not head-on, but symptomatically, and, since there's no harm in admitting it, snobbishly. She does not open by offering a history of bourgeois individualism, but by decrying its most obvious social and institutional manifestations. First, there is the spread of education, which ritualizes the subjective illusion by stressing the personal and individual nature of all one's failures and successes. Second, there's the proliferation of print culture, all the tracts, pamphlets, advertisements, gratuitous copies of magazines, and the literary production of friends that arrive by post, by van, by messenger, at all hours of the day, Woolf complains. For her, the British public sphere is characterized by all manner of excess, beginning with a dramatic increase in literacy rates, then a rise in the distinct genres of literary production, their means of distribution, and their frequency of circulation. The relentless churn of both schools and presses results ultimately in the flattening of all this written matter, and in a feeling of oversaturation, of boredom on the part of the reader who impatiently bears the onslaught. But her boredom is not the boredom one feels when confronted with an apparently infinite and depersonalized expanse of textuality, the boredom of slogging through tightly packed columns of news items in a 19th century periodical, for instance, or of marking dozens of anonymized student exams. Rather, it is the boredom of having to attend to, quote, a very large number of people, Woolf imagines, all of whom demand public recognition through the projection of a private interiority. The intimate connection between education, the bourgeois public sphere, and the specter of private individuality, however loose or sketchily arrived at, compels Woolf to judge the personal essay a sign of the times. It is the genre whose linguistic style, the capital I of I think or I feel, not only draws the individual into public, but also insists upon the value, the primacy, and the spontaneity of the individual qua individual. This ideological fiction unfurls regardless of the quality of the essayist's prose or thought. In fact, a little bit later on in this essay, during a part that I probably won't read today, I argue that there is an inverse relation between style and content, or the quality of style and the quantity of personalized content delivered. The personal essay's significance lies not so much in the fact that we have attained any brilliant success in essay writing, but in the undoubted facility with which we write essays as though this were beyond all others our natural way of speaking, Woolf asserts, with the amiable garrulity of the tea room. It is primarily an expression of personal opinion, though the stress almost always seems to fall on the personal, its peculiarities, its individual likes and dislikes, rather than the strength of the opinion expressed or its style of expression. While these individual likes and dislikes certainly add up to large numbers, a word that Woolf repeats with amazement and scorn throughout the decay of essay writing, the numbers do not combine in any sensible or meaningful way. They cannot be imagined as a mass, a totality, cannot be integrated and set to any collective social or political purpose. Even in aggregate, they demand to be recognized as an actually existing set of potentially innumerable humans, as Michael Warner has described the projection of personhood in the bourgeois public sphere. Now, one of my favorite parts of the decay of essay writing is that it concludes with what I take to be two pitches for potential personal essays. The first of which is aesthetically and ethically permissible, according to Woolf, and the second is just wholly unacceptable. To say simply, I have a garden, and I will tell you what plants do best in my garden, possibly justifies its egoism, Woolf writes. But to say, I have no sons, though I have 6 daughters, all unmarried, but I will tell you how I should have brought up my sons had I had any, is not interesting, cannot be useful, and is a specimen of the amazing and unclothed egoism for which first the art of penmanship and then the invention of essay writing are responsible. Her examples, are as symptomatically revealing as the rest of the essay. In the first, the essayist's objects are her plants, located in the garden outside the home. Their beauty is visible to any and all who stop to gaze upon them. The history of their climb and blossom is untouched, in Woolf's pitch, by the presence of the gardener. No one appears to fuss over tendrils and buds, to dramatize what needs no drama, the impersonal passage of time, the non-human action of growth and decay. In her second example, by contrast, the essayist's object is herself, how she has managed or fantasizes having managed the intimate affairs of her household. The offspring she has collected cannot be discarded. No one will have them. The failure of these private people to leave the house, to journey into the wider world, offers on the one hand an uninteresting interior rumination, how she should have brought up her sons had she had any, and on the other, a wishful allegory about the future of the essay form. The tacit hope Woolf expresses, I think, is that one day soon, the essay too may find itself blocked from circulating stories about people outside of the house. The decay of essay writing appeared in 1905, roughly the same time that the genre descriptor, the personal essay, began to spread through the English lexicon. To speak of the personal essay before then would have been to speak in ciphers, in gibberish, as well as to traffic in redundancies. And if you do a very quick Google engram of the personal essay, you'll see the track that it follows is that it sort of pops up right around the turn of the century and begins to rise in a sort of uneven way through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And then by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s, it starts to really rise precipitously from there before leveling out somewhere around the 2000s. I only have a cold, don't worry. Indeed, prior to the 20th century, the essay as a form was assumed to be personal, but only obliquely so. Reading across dozens of composition and expository writing textbooks from 1900 to 1940 reveals that the personal was not conveyed on the level of action, not, to echo Woolf, through the simple words, I was born, and a description of the startling events that may have then transpired. Rather, it was on the level of style, a different form of excess from the kinds of excess Woolf decries. Style was marked by the excess and the aberrance of language, by an author's pace, punctuation, diction, and grammar, her distinctive deployment of adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions, which, as Jeff Dolvin has observed, cannot be counted on to shore up the first person as a verb does. To give you just 3 examples from my favorite stylists, and they're completely predictable. Consider Woolf's ungrammatical fondness for semicolons, her ecstatic tendency to stack nouns in threes and adjectives in fours. Consider Elizabeth Hardwick's love of trebling adjectives and hitching an adverb to the very last one, so that her description of a person or object appears to increase in precision exponentially and within the smallest span of a sentence. Consider Joan Didion's habit of beginning an essay with a missing antecedent to create the impression that writer and reader have both arrived at a scene in medias res, as wry and unobtrusive observers. Framed by teachers of writing as conversational and chatty, its style characterized by its air of spontaneity, the essay suggested the author's personality as a diffuse and specular structure. Indeed, its refusal to subject its bearer to direct observation or interrogation was an integral part of its formal signature. So the essays from earlier centuries that are retro-projected as personal today, and what I mean by that is that you will often hear people speak, or you will see in essay collections about the essay, people refer to Montaigne as writing personal essays, or people referring to Hazlitt as writing personal essays. But the tendency to call those writers of personal essays is actually a very recent phenomenon. So the essays from earlier centuries that are retro-projected as personal today were, during the first half of the 20th century, more commonly referred to as familiar essays. Their antonyms were essays classed as didactic, factual, informative, or instructive. The familiar essay made no claims about the autobiographical nature of its content. It seldom treated the author as its object of interest. Rather, familiarity concerned the quality of the relationship the essay projected between its writer and its reader, a relationship between two friends as opposed to the relationship between a teacher and her pupil. Always, this friendship was mediated by the presence of an object to which the writer had committed her powers of perception and analysis, and through it had compelled her reader's interest. A novel or a painting, a historic figure like Cato, a shape like a circle, a creature like a moth, a place like a garden. The familiar essay unfolded by creating a scene of triangulation between the essayist, her reader, and the object that now shared their attention. One might put it thus, wrote Christopher Morley in the 1921 introduction to his anthology, Modern Essays, that the perfection of the familiar essay is a conscious revelation of self done inadvertently. By contrast, the personal essay, groping and stumbling its way into being, distinguished itself from the beginning by its failure to maintain this practice of triangulation, its unwillingness to commit to inadvertency. It indulged the temptation to fall into monologue, Morley complained, allowing its language to curdle into a content too ostentatiously quaint, too deliberately whimsical, the word which by loathsome repetition has become emetic. Yet as nearly all of the composition textbooks from the early 20th century recognized, direct address could not be avoided entirely. Any use of the I ensured its projection. Yet its influence on the overall scene of essay writing and reading could be minimized, unbalanced and overshadowed by competing forms of address that presented themselves as more sociable, accessible, and depersonalized in the kind of friendship they imagined. Indeed, they held the imagination of impersonality to be a sign of the essay's aesthetic and ethical success. It has seemed to me lately more possible than I know to carry a friendship greatly on one side without due correspondence on the other, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson in On Friendship, his 1941 essay about the poetics of familiarity. The asymmetry in the exchange of written words between friends was not to be lamented, Emerson reassured his readers. Indeed, from an aesthetic and ethical point of view, it was to be celebrated for mediating sociality through the cultivated idiosyncrasy of prose rather than the incidental particularity of personhood. The higher the style we demand of friendship, of course, the less easy to establish it with flesh and blood, Emerson concluded. But this was a difficulty to be welcomed, forcing relationality away from face-to-face situations of address, whether real or imagined, and dispersing it across a vast and indefinite public. To write an essay in a conspicuously marked style was to labor to convert one's personality into prose, canceling the thick walls of individual character, relation, age, sex, circumstance, Emerson wrote. Whatever prejudices inhered in flesh and blood friendship, indeed whatever prejudices cruelly limited who one might consider a friend in 19th century America, could be overcome by the skillful diffusion of an embodied and marked presence into an apparently unmarked language. And I think something that's very important to that concept that I go on to explain a little bit later on in the longer version of this essay is the idea of skill, of the skill of style being visible and the labor of craft being something that's apparent in the writing itself, as opposed to the mere relation of experience, which anybody can have. And so there's a kind of theory of distinction that's being offered there, I think, along with the theory of friendship or of sociality. Of course, as Michael Warner has noted, any avowal of impartial publicness is never as impartial as it insists. Public styles are always marked by the specifics of nationality, literacy, class, and race. There exists no such thing as a perfectly inclusive or universal or infinitely circulating language. Just as there's no such thing really as an inclusive or universal or infinite friendship. And Emerson's, no doubt, depends on the ethos of a particular time and place and way of being to secure his readers' feelings of affinity, of mutual understanding. Yet his claim to mediating friendship through style nevertheless reveals how, against the rising tide of individualism, the familiar essay once demanded that its readers place the highest premium on the imaginative interactions of non-intimate selves. Its social and collective mode of address positions itself as countering, if only partially and imperfectly, the discursive performance of private personhood. It is the friction between these two modes of representation that the contemporary personal essay smooths away, or purges, to extend Morley's metaphor, with ever-increasing vigor as we reach the 20th and 21st centuries. So that's the end of the talk. The rest of the piece goes on to detail why it is that we see the personal essay, as I framed it and described it as a genre, begin to rise after the 1900s, but particularly after the 1940s and 50s. And it offers an account of the college admissions essay as the sort of subgenre that takes up the majority of the field of personal essay writing. And that takes you to about the 70s and 80s. And then from there, it offers an account of the importance of confession and of confessional writing to a publishing industry that is under increasing pressure to simply convert experience into narrative, to do away with the kind of professionalized skills of craft and style that were so important to somebody like Emerson in his imagination of what the essay could do. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to our roundtable.